You.
Okay, so we gotta settle this. This has been a source of some conversation.
Try and keep it on the mat.
Okay. Do you want to do high roll or odds evens?
Oh, right. This has been a source of conversation. I'm happy with high roll.
High roll also, yeah.
Yeah. I've been high roll for life, basically.
Odds evens is if you want to signal to your opponent that you're really smart and understand mathematics at the beginning of the match.
Okay.
I prefer to just let the cards talk,
I like that.
Versus the guy she tells you not to worry about.
Shall we do best poker hand to decide who gets to go first?
No.
Come on, poker hands.
I don't even know what a good poker hand is.
You don't have to know. You're not making any decision. You're rolling it at
I
random.
don't have to know. You just make it up and you just say,
Oh, yeah, because chat's going to let me lie about poker hands. Here we go. We're going to do poker hands. Ooh, that's...
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the best
straight.
one you can get, right? That's better than a full house?
Good night, Tentacle Monster.
No,
Thanks
you
for
could get
joining us.
5 of a kind or
Five
4
of
of a kind,
is
and that
better.
would be the straight.
All right,
So
well.
I got a straight. You either need Yahtzee or near
These are
Yahtzee.
big dice
They're
also.
kind of hard to roll 5 of those, I'm not going to lie.
All right, we got...
Ooh, 2 pair. That's not going to
two
beat a
pair.
straight. Sorry,
Damn.
I will take the play. All right, you ready to go?
Sure.
Sound not confident.
Great. Confident. I got no notes. I got a stack of magic cards, and I guess we'll just talk about them one by one.
Super duper. In that case, welcome to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony High Roll Maddox.
It's the traditional way to determine who goes first, and I don't see why we need to change it, just because every once in a while you gotta re-roll, and it's really unnecessary.
Have I used this nickname before? Do you know?
I don't think so.
It feels like I could have, but
It's possible, yeah.
maybe. Who knows? We're going to reuse nickname, folks. It's going to happen. I'm just not going to...
What about, you can do things that
gonna
are
forget.
really timely. Anthony totally missed the couch being carried up a pair of 2 ladders and through a window. That would be a pretty good
Did you
nickname.
totally miss it? Or did you get at least the little tail end
No,
of it?
I was 3 minutes late, and you were done.
Oh, well, there you go. Yep, put a couch through the second-story window of my house today. My wife was concerned it wouldn't work. She was like, I can't be here. I'm going to have a meltdown. You're going to fall off the roof and die.
I think these are really reasonable concerns.
I disagree.
I feel like there's a
Unreasonable.
rule about ladders, and one of them is don't carry a couch up one. That just I'm pretty sure
well,
that's
we carried
a
it
rule.
up 2 ladders, so
Add
to be
more
fair.
ladders makes it safer.
Yeah, it went great. It was fine, exactly as I predicted. Only took like 6 minutes. Boom, bang, bop. Now I just can never move because that couch can't leave that room except through that window. Coming down is actually going to be a lot harder.
Really?
I think so.
I feel like you just push it off.
Well, that's if you don't care about the couch. If you care about the couch, coming down is going to be kind of hard. High roll. You prefer high roll to determine who goes first in a game of Magic.
I prefer, I don't feel like I need to introduce the decision point of having multiple ways of choosing who goes first.
But you
we're
don't get to
already
control
there.
that.
I know, we're already here.
I'm just curious as to why you've landed on this.
Isn't that what everybody does?
I don't think so.
That's what everybody did until people started, doing all kinds of poker hands and all kinds of wacky
Okay,
stuff.
look, poker hands is explicitly wacky. I think evens and odds is perfectly fine. Like, here's my logic. Look, on a recent episode of Shuffle Up and Play, Patrick Sullivan says that he always says high roll because if you want to do evens and odds, you're just trying to prove that you're smart and you understand statistics before a game. Which, fair. Okay, fine. I see you, Patrick. Here's what I'll say about high roll. I think the reason some people, I'm not going to say you can speak for yourself. I think the reason some people prefer high roll is because there's not one clearly better than the other when it comes to evens and odds. So you make an arbitrary decision and there's an arbitrary
There's
outcome.
another arbitrary choice that I have to make, and I don't want to make that arbitrary choice.
Is that maybe that's why you don't like it?
Maybe
Just because
that's why I
you're
don't
forced
like
to
it,
make an
yeah.
arbitrary choice.
Altogether, I just want to cut down on these erroneous decision points. I feel like somebody that really captured this spirit really well to me was on Bunta Vista when they were talking about Americans and the way they use the parking brake, and a lot of Americans just don't use their parking brake. But it actually just makes it more complex of a whole process if you're deciding whether or not you're going to use the parking brake, whether or not you're on a hill. It's like, sure, you're saving steps, but you're adding decision points, you're adding complexity to that experience. And
so you're concerned you're going to
really
forget to say
resonated
even or
with me.
odd, and then it's going to break the
Sure,
transmission of the
I don't know
Magic
exactly
game?
what. Yeah, the whole undercarriage of that Magic game is just going to fall out.
If we're going to go so bold as to claim that people that like evens and odds are trying to prove they're smarter than somebody else, then I'm gonna say that if you prefer high roll, that's just like a line goes up relic of capitalism. You're just like, bigger numbers are better, therefore I want to be the one that gets the bigger, better number.
Bigger numbers are better.
And a lot of situations they're
Sandwiches.
worse. For example, parts per million
Golf.
of CO2 in the atmosphere. or
unless you're a plant. Context matters.
degrees of change of the oceans, or
Ooh, yeah.
number of pieces of microplastics found in a newborn baby. You know, these numbers are not good to be high
You picked
numbers.
some really bad numbers there.
Yeah, I did.
Wow. Well, so the thing I do like to do is I have the +1/+1 counter, -1/-1 counter dice. I do like to say high roll and then roll those and then say, I got a -3. I think that's kind of fun.
I
and
spent an
people enjoy that.
embarrassing amount of time in my head while I was doing chores
trying
the
to
other
figure
day.
out if that was different than
Trying to figure out if that was it all different. I mean, obviously you're both doing the same roll, so you're equally. What I was trying to figure out is, are you more likely to somehow get a tie that way? And I don't think so, but
no.
it took a lot of thinking.
I'm pretty confident no.
Why are you so confident, though?
Because it's the same. I mean, you could just replace them with any numbers at all, like any 6 distinct options, and it's the same statistical significance.
Yeah, I guess. It feels weird to me.
You roll 1, the chance of the second one being the same is. Or wait, what's the question?
Rolling the same value. I was trying to figure out, it's like, but my first thought was like, wait, you can get the same overall value in different ways when you have positive and negative,
But
which
that's
is
the
true,
same
but it's
as-
also true of regular dice, obviously, like just 2 positive values. And then I was like, well, it matters which one's positive and which one's negative in this case, because, rolling a 4 and a 2 on regular dice is always a 6. Rolling a 4 and a 2 on the +1 - dice means you're going to have either +2 or -2. And I was like, does that affect anything? And then I was like, I still don't think so. It's weird.
I'm you lost me a little bit, but yeah, it's the same.
I'm saying that in some ways, given a independent roll of the dice, the fact that you're rolling +1 -1 die means that your outcome cares about which die is which value, which is not true in regular dice because they're both just positive values in air quotes. And so I agree, after a lot of thinking while I was doing my chores, that it all comes out in the wash and you have the same significance of all the different possible outcomes. But it feels weird that which one's positive and which one's negative could potentially matter.
Interesting.
You don't think so?
I don't know if I totally follow. It is interesting how when you try and like apply heuristics of the way that you think about numbers, sometimes it feels different in. What am I trying to say? This is confusing me altogether.
I'm going to make you a set of dice that has +1, +2, +3, -1, -2, -3 on the 6 sides, and then opposite sides obviously add up to 0 instead of 7, and then you can roll those to figure out who gets to go first.
Cool.
Pretty sure still the same chances.
Still going to be the
outcomes.
same.
I'm
Still
pretty
going to be
sure.
the same.
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. Anyway, evens odds for life. I guess if you don't want to make the choice, we are in this annoying place where you don't want to make the choice, so you choose something the same every single time, but other people in our playgroup also do that, and you each have different things that you do, so I can never remember who's odd and who's even. You're even.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, same goes for, Mana Crypt. Odds are always bad. Easy. The even is just always
odds are owl.
the thing that you choose. And that just makes it easier.
Well, this is not a very bad statistics podcast. This is instead a podcast about Magic the Gathering. And this week we are talking about my in-progress new cube, the Neoclassical cube, which Anthony and I both have a fat stack of in our hands right now to distract us as we're trying to record a podcast. And I'm just going to talk about the sort of background of this cube and what I'm thinking about it to introduce it to everybody. And this cube is nowhere near done yet, both in terms of like actual design. I'm sure there are major oversights right now in the cards included versus my stated goals and how I want the environment to play. And it's also not done literally in paper because I only have, I think, like 60-75% of the cube, somewhere around there. So haven't play tested it yet. This is still very early days, but I thought it might be interesting to give people a look behind the scenes on how we think about cubes, or at least I think about cubes in the very early stages of a design process.
I think this cube is going to be a huge hit. I think everybody's going to love it. Just gonna call that shot right now.
I think, like any cube, some people are going to love it and some people are not going to love it. We'll see, though. I'm just going to dive in with some of the background of this cube. So I actually technically started this cube on Cube Cobra like a long time ago. I want to say a year, and I could check. Probably like a year and a half ago, 18 months, I would guess. And I called it the Neoclassical cube all this time ago. But initially, the conceit was different. My initial idea was I was having some discussion with somebody in the Cube Discord and talking about how I felt like cube design as a practice, like the theory of cube design, had evolved a lot from the early days of cube design. And this person disagreed in some way or another and was just like, well, it's just we have more cards, so you think there's new ways to design cubes, but actually it's just more cards in the pool. And so I undertook this like exercise where I was like, I'm going to design what I consider to be a cube by modern cube theory standards with only old border cards, just as like an example of if I was back in 2001 and I wanted to design a cube, how could I do it with my current preferences in playstyle of Magic?
So, like many creative projects, it started as just an exercise to prove someone wrong.
Not to prove, I mean, it doesn't prove anything. It was an exercise in just like, here's an idea I have. I think that the way I think about a cube now is way different than I did when I first started designing cubes. I think that's true for us collectively as a whole. I do think that there is enough communication within this community that there is a collective progress that's happening. I think we are all better at designing cubes today than we were 3 years ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago, because there's more theory and more talk about it.
Yeah, and I think especially the mentality of cube has to be the X best cards in Magic has really gone away in the last couple of years. People are just being a lot more creative and thinking about different ways to approach it, but they're also approaching it with this broader card pool with all these new cards. So I think that there was a lot of space that is potentially still unexplored where people haven't necessarily taken this modern mentality to that more limited card pool of older cards. And I think that's sort of what your thesis was, right?
Yeah, and honestly, I wonder if some of the cards Wizards has printed in the past few years have heavily contributed to people no longer being just like, I'm putting the most powerful cards in my cube, because
Definitely.
maybe that is really unfun these days if you literally just like you got Minsk and Boo and Oko and Power and all these complicated cards with mechanics that don't matter in single player and blah 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 blah. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate because I've not played a cube like that that's truly power max with the modern card pool. The things I was trying to explore that I thought were like the simplest ways that cube design had changed was like I wanted to lower the curve substantially from what I see most, pre-modern cubes running. I wanted to run a much higher land count, which I think is something that we've collectively done a better job at explaining why we like higher land counts and, talking about the roots of lower land counts in cubes. I was going to break Singleton on at least some things, on at least mana fixing, maybe some other things. I think Singleton was originally seen as kind of sacred, and people were not really willing to break it for anything because it felt wrong, and I think that we're largely beyond that, and people understand that it is a tool that can be used sometimes if you want to use it. So the result, and you can actually go scrub back through the history on Cube Cobra. I guess you can't really look at previous versions, but you can see all the cards I cut and get a sense for what the cube was like back then. And it was an interesting, experiment. It ended up being like, a bunch of copies of Grim. I ended up breaking Singleton on a fair number of cards just to keep the power band narrow. That was one of the other things I felt like was a artifact of modern cube design, was a really narrow power band, where I think old border cubes or cubes back in the day had a much wider power level band. In order to do that, I was breaking Singleton on more cards because there was a smaller card pool, so it was harder to get 6 2-drops within a reasonable power level. Anyway, it was an interesting thought experiment. I never drafted with anybody or anything, and I just kind of left it unattended. And I have a million of these things on Cube Cobra where it's like, I had an idea, put a bunch of cards in a list, looked at it for a while, and then ignored it. Then, fast forward to this past October, I played the Old Border foil cube at CubeCon. And as I've mentioned on the show before, that cube was kind of revelatory for me because it felt really different from modern Magic. I was not prepared for how different it was going to feel from what my cube feels like, what even your cube feels like. It just felt so different to play with cards that were only with mechanics printed in Old Border Magic. And that cube specifically included some cards with new Old Borders. Things that stand out were like Sigil of the Empty Throne was in there because I know that he really wanted to push an Enchantress deck in that cube, and that's just a much better Enchantress payoff than you have in any actual Old Border cards, even though this one has been retroactively Old Bordered. And honestly, I remember them really standing out. It was like, oh, these cards are just,
yeah, for sure.
They feel different. They feel like much better, and they do more stuff. When I said on the show that it felt really different, I got a fair number of people that, messaged me or emailed me and was like, how was it different? Like, what's the way in which it felt different? And I don't know that I can explain all of it, but part of it was definitely just the complexity, right? I mean, modern Magic cards are complicated, and Mark Rosewater has talked about how complexity is the biggest threat to the future of Magic because that's what's going to have to keep amping up, even more so than power level, as more and more cards are made if they want to keep making unique Magic cards. So
right, there's only so many simple things that they can do, but once you get more complex, there's more and more space that gets opened up.
Yeah. So it felt simpler, and not just that the cards were simpler and it was very easy to understand what a card did or whatever, but also just that the board states felt simpler. It was like, okay, well, in this situation, my opponent needs X kind of card. It felt like I was having different strategic thoughts because of the relative simplicity. And I knew that my opponent was not going to play a Planeswalker or whatever, which cuts off a whole line of what happens if the game goes this direction. And that's, neither good or bad. It was just very, very different. Another thing I noticed was the cube had a very wide power level band because Jeff, the designer of the Old Border foil cube, is specifically working within an even narrower card pool than pre-modern, because a lot of pre-modern sets weren't printed in foil. So really, Jeff is looking at like Urza's Legacy through 7th edition, right? That's the sort of range of sets that this cube can possibly pull from. So there is a wider power level band. The power outliers are really good, and the weaker cards are substantially worse. But something I noticed about old border power outliers, and people complain about Okos and Minsc and Boos and stuff all you want, but obviously early days of Magic had even more broken cards, right? Pound for pound. If you look at things like Gaia's Cradle and Mind Twist and obviously the power and stuff like that, like those cards are utterly broken. But the thing I noticed about them was that it really felt like every power outlier was a sort of build around. It was sort of synergistic, right? Like even Gaia's Cradle doesn't do anything if you have no creatures in play, right? I mean, that's
literally nothing.
That's kind of a laughable downside to some people, but like I've seen it come up in my own cube before where you just have your Gaia's Cradle, and if it was a regular basic land, you would be able to cast some spell, but you have no creatures in play because your opponent just wiped the board and now it does nothing. All the cards that were power level outliers required you to draft around them, play around them, like do some work to get them to be good. There wasn't anything that was just, all you have to do is draw your lands and play me,
Oko,
and I'll take over.
Whatever happens, you're going to be in a good situation. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the closest thing to that is like, your Exalted Angels or, like Spirit Monger even, right? Like these weird old big creatures that had some sort of protection, but they're so much worse and more inefficient than the powerful cards that factor of just like draw, play your lands, play this card, like that was just not how the games played out at all. That was not what mattered in any of the games. It was always combining your cards to get the most out of some weird power outlier.
Totally. I mean, I just read an article that Parker referenced me to by Patrick Chapin, talking about sort of what Standard looked like at the time. This article was from, I think, 2017. But one of the things that really stood out to me was he was talking about that a lot of the modern card design just didn't require investment on the part of the player. It was just, you just play the card, and it's like, well, it's no longer a creature that's, a 5-mana 2/2 that you have to build around and sort of figure out how to make it work. It's just going to be a 5-mana 6/6 because why not? Which just meant that, it just means that a lot of the games don't have that kind of tension in the same way, where you really have to figure out how do you maximize and what are the risks that you're taking and how are you trying to mitigate those, which I think is just a big change in the way that they design Magic cards today.
We talk about the like 5-color good stuff deck that some cube designers really don't like, and that's exactly how you end up there, right? If It doesn't matter how you combine your cards with each other or what order you draw them in or what order you cast them in, they're just all standalone, independent islands of power, then yeah, you can just get the right fixing and put them all in a deck together and it will like more or less work. So I just noticed that a lot of these cards required you to largely draft around them. Like you have to have the right deck, right? And some of these cards are cards that I was really interested in the earliest versions of my cube, right? Things like Wildfire or Upheaval or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, talk about cards that you really need to make work. Like, that takes a big investment. That card doesn't do anything on its own.
Right, like an Upheaval deck is an Upheaval deck. Like you have to have a bunch of mana acceleration, hopefully artifacts, so you can cast a big Upheaval, floating a bunch of mana, and then chain together a bunch of artifact ramp after that so you can rebuild faster, right? Like your whole deck has to be designed around that to really make it work. Mind Twist is maybe the best example I can think of a card that like kind of stands on its own. I mean, it's still contextual. If you top deck it and your opponent's way ahead on board, who cares? But even that, I think, really shines when you build around it right and you like have enough ramp to cast it early for a bigger value than you should. You Dark Ritual into it or something. That was a big thing I noticed too. And the ways that this cube differed from my main cube, the Bun Magic cube, this cube basically like essentially violated a lot of the things that I state as my goals for the Bun Magic cube. It was playing a lot of things I would never play in my own cube. Very different intentions, obviously. But I was like, this is still really, really fun. And it was really fun in a way that felt different enough that I was like, it'd be interesting to have this kind of game as an option when we do a cube draft instead of, the other kind of game. Because it felt so different. It was the thing that really struck me. So that in combination with a couple other nascent threads that have been floating around my head. So for a while, I've kind of wanted a beater cube. I love both of my cubes I have in paper, but, my regular Bun Magic cube is in like a big custom wooden box that I adore. I wouldn't trade it for the world, but also it's kind of a hassle to drag around to the LGS. And also, like we could do a whole conversation about like, playing with fairly expensive cards. And I'm a big advocate for like, you got them to play with them, so play with them. But also, I mean, I'd be lying if there's not like a weird, thought that goes through your head when you see somebody like riffle shuffling your foil Birds of Paradise and you're like, well, it's probably fine. It's double sleeve, whatever. But,
Nice. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a thing that I really enjoy about my cube being sort of a budget-ish cube, even though I do also have a pretty big collection. It's really nice to just be able to take it to the bar, take it to the LGS, and just, like, not worry about it that much, because I don't have the, value of a small car in my backpack.
Yeah. So those thoughts definitely come up sometimes, and they're not great. And the other thing I have actually been wanting in Magic more broadly for a couple years now is when I first saw the Gonti EDH deck full of like totally trashed cards, I thought it was like brilliant and super cool. And for those that don't know, this is DJ, forget his last name, some like big Magic community guy. He it was a card seller for a long time, and as he would be buying collections from people and like moving a bunch of cards through his shop, he would pull all of these like really damaged cards that like came through his hands, and eventually started combining them into this really beautiful Gonti EDH deck, which since I first learned about it, Ristic Studies has done a video on it, and now I think a lot more people know about it, which is great. It's also a beautiful video. Of course, it'll be linked in the show notes. And it's just a really interesting artifact, right? In this deck, the cards are really trashed in some cases. I mean, some of them are missing half the card, some of them are like completely illegible, or
somebody like altered and then tried to undo the alter, and so it's in such a weird, and then recover it with a new alter because it looked like crap.
So he's taking it to a really deep extreme, but something about just the idea of having some cards I could play with unsleeved, which I played as a kid, right? I remember playing before sleeves existed, or at least were common. I didn't have sleeves when I was growing up, so the idea of just playing with some Magic cards and getting to look at the back art, and just like have that experience, that nostalgia, is something I've wanted for a while too. All these things kind of combined, right? I'm like, okay, I want to explore a cube with old-fashioned mechanics, which is already nostalgic. I've wanted to have some sort of unsleeved Magic project, whether it's a commander deck or a cube or whatever, because that's a cool idea that I really like and I'm going to steal. And also, I want a beater cube, a cheaper cube I can just kind of not care about and like take anywhere I want. That's kind of what all came together to make what is the modern iteration of what I'm calling the Neoclassical cube.
That's always so satisfying when you have like a couple ideas sort of floating around and then something else sort of, especially when, two things you're already thinking about and then there's some third piece of connective tissue comes in and just makes everything make sense. That's one of the more satisfying kind of creative experiences.
It is, and that story is very similar to how the Degenerate Microcube came to be, right? Like I saw the idea of a Microcube with 15 card decks at some point and was like, that's interesting. What could I explore in that space? And then other ideas of like specific kinds of combos and decks that I wanted to make work also eventually kind of came together. And it really felt like I had this idea in the back of my head for a year. And then all of a sudden that missing piece fell into place. And it's like, oh, now there's something. Now I see the whole picture and I can actually make this thing. And that's what I feel about this cube right now. So here's the conceit of the cube. It is a mostly pre-modern cube, which means that the cards are mostly old border printed in the earliest days of Magic. I am not strictly holding myself to just old border cards for a couple of reasons. One, in the spirit of neoclassicism, I really want to include modern takes on cards that were clearly heavily inspired or callbacks to original versions of cards. And I'll get into some examples later on, but that's a thing that Magic does all the time, right? Because it's a nostalgia machine and because they have to make a million zillion cards a year. So doing callbacks to old cards, either mechanically or flavorfully, is something they do all the time.
I feel like the Modern Horizons sets have been like a huge example of that.
Absolutely.
Because those are, made for the enfranchised player and is space where don't have the same constraints as a lot of the Premier sets.
Yeah. So I am putting some new modern cards in there. My rules for the modern inclusions are, I want them all basically to be things that theoretically could have been printed in old border, both in terms of power level, in terms of mechanics. So I don't want anything, I'm not going to put any planeswalkers in there. I don't want anything that, has a really radical modern mechanic like some double-faced card. So really just stuff that could have, in theory, been in the design file for, Scourge or Onslaught or whatever. And I'm going to play it unsleeved. And because I'm playing it unsleeved, and there are some valuable cards that I want for this list, I find myself in the exact same situation that DJ found himself in, where it's like, okay, if I want to play this unsleeved, and I don't want to, like, trash nice cards, which I don't want to do, right? Like, I'm not a person that's like, I'm going to go get a brand new card and intentionally shuffle it up and mess it up to make it trashed. That means I have to find trashed versions of the expensive cards so that I'm not making them worse by playing them unsleeved, right? So am I going to let myself, put a Wheel of Fortune in here? I am. I'm going to try and find a Wheel of Fortune that looks bad enough that I don't mind riffle shuffling in and letting my, players riffle shuffle it and just not care about it.
Does that still fit with your beater cube desires? Because it's still going to be a pricey cube, I think, even if you find a cheap Wheel of Fortune and a couple other things in this list.
Yeah, I think, I mean, yes is the answer. I think so. Because part of it is like, I don't really, for better or worse, I don't really worry about people stealing my cards. And I'm not sure if that's what most people are concerned about when they are worried about taking an expensive cube around, that people are going to like just pocket their cards. I'm more just worried about like somebody, being careless and, accidentally leaving it under a playmat or, dropping it on the ground or like just random stuff like that is more what I'm concerned about. And like that I wouldn't be concerned about with any of these cards at all. Also, they're going to be really messed up, so I don't know if people are even going to want them, right? Like even if you were
somebody steals the Wheel of Fortune that says,
you're going to be able to tell
poop in pants on it, and then that shows up in their commander deck next week, you'll know.
Yeah, so yes, it still fits my beater cube goals to a T, I think, because I'm not going to be worried about it. It's just going to be a pile of cards. So that's kind of the background in terms of like how the cube came to be and what my like broad overarching goals are. So I do want to capture the play patterns of pre-modern Magic, but augment those play patterns with modern cards to have callbacks and like fun, thematic 1/2s. For example, a Chroma Angel of Wrath is a like old school reanimator target. It's an 8-mana angel with a bunch of keyword abilities and vigilance. And, by modern standards, it's not good at all because it only has protection from red and black, so they can do any other kind of removal on it, and your whole reanimator strategy is gone. But back in the day, it was one of the best options you had. This was called back to very specifically in one of the Future Sight sets in Planar Chaos, where they did a Chroma Angel of Fury, right? So the idea of having both of these angels in there is really appealing to me. Like, here's the old version, and here's the sort of modern interpretation of it, which I think is really cool. Also, the modern interpretation uses Morph, which is a mechanic that was in Old Border, and there are some Old Border cards with Morph in the cube, so it all kind of comes together and paints a nice picture. The other reason I want to let myself use the broader modern card pool is because I think it will allow me to make a more balanced environment, because where some decks that I like thematically, I like what the deck is trying to do, but it's falling short of just playable cards or power level or whatever, I can just kind of juice it with some more like redundant or otherwise similar effects that are printed in Modern Border and still have it feel all thematic and all from the same place. I think this all starts with the like synergistic power outliers, right? We talk a lot about this idea of like drafting decks, not just cards, right? And building your cube so that players can draft good decks, not just draft good cards. I do think in pre-modern Magic, a lot of the good decks were largely driven by just having a specific good card and building around it, right? What flows from that naturally is tutors. I just put a lot of tutors in here, right? So this cube has Demonic Tutor, it has Vampiric Tutor, it has Mystical Tutor, it has Enlightened Tutor. Things that I don't like in my main cube for a variety of reasons, but that are totally appropriate here given the nature of like, if you build an upheaval deck, there's only one upheaval in the cube, you have to be able to find upheaval, right? And so having ways to find that, key piece you built your deck around, or to find the important B to your synergistic A, like those things I think are really supported by tutors. And so that's something else I just threw in there. Tutors also feel very old school Magic to me, right? Like we don't get cards like the original Tutor Cycle or Demonic Tutor anymore, right? They just wouldn't print that into a modern set at anything less than like 4 mana.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but it definitely just changes the aesthetic of those kinds of mechanics where you just don't see them anymore, so it feels like this sort of relic of a different time of the game. Yeah, I think it's an interesting contrast there, especially with the tutors, because I do feel like if you put a bunch in the Bun Magic Cube, I feel like it would just sort of make games feel more the same. Like you'd have more decks that could just even more consistently execute on the one plan, which I think I agree isn't as fun. Like the variance is fun, but on the other hand, they are actually going to enable more diverse type of decks in this environment, right, probably. So on the other hand, it's like, well, it makes games more consistent, more uniform, but it also means that, this upheaval can actually be a player, can actually fit into decks. Whereas, you're losing agency in a different way. You're losing diversity in a different way if there's just not the support and redundancy to make it work. Yeah,
that all definitely feels true. The idea of kind of embracing the variance to some degree in the Bun Magic Cube, what I've said a lot, which I think is true, is that I want variance to be a thing that every player is fighting against in that cube, right? Like the reason I have a bunch of cantrips and a bunch of density of mana fixing is because I want players to have the option to choose to limit their own variance and decide whether they want to spend their picks and their equity on ways to limit that variance or on power outliers in specific colors. I want that to be one of the metrics in which they're trying to weigh against. I'm not convinced that tutors would even be that good in the Bun Magic Cube. I think the only ones you could even have a conversation about realistically are mystical, vampiric, and demonic. I think anything beyond that is probably not great. Maybe Worldly Tutor, maybe. But the creature decks, right, there's... To go down a card and a mana to get a specific creature in that environment is usually not worth it, as opposed to just having another creature, right? There's a pretty narrow power level band, and so I think it's rarely going to be worth it to do that in that situation. And even Demonic Tutor, right? Like, my cube is very low curving. The aggro decks are extremely aggressive. You don't often just have 2 mana to take off. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm taking Demonic Tutor very highly. You love
cantrips, and it's a pretty good cantrip.
Don't get me wrong. I'm putting Demonic Tutor in every single one of my black decks, and I'm taking it very highly if it's in my cube. But I don't think it would feel like, oh, Demonic Tutor can't beat that. I think it would be like, okay, that's a really good cantrip, right? That's like an extremely good impulse, which would be good, but I don't think necessarily break the environment. Here, I think it is going to behave, or I hope it's going to behave exactly like you're describing, because of these tutors, instead of narrowing what's possible and just making all the decks, more consistent and kind of just honing in on this one kind of gameplay. I hope it really enables more variety in decks, because you can now use this Demonic Tutor as kind of like you think of Demonic Tutor as like a placeholder card where it has all the build-arounds in the cube written on it, and you can draft it and check off whichever one you want, right? Like, I'm playing the Upheaval deck, or I'm playing the Recurring Nightmare deck, or I'm playing the...
Are you going to let people write what they're tutoring for on the card and let it, like, slowly build up over time with...
I guess we didn't say that. So I'm looking for trash versions of these cards, and I've been looking since CubeCon, basically. So for the past, few months, I've been slowly collecting the cards for this cube. And very quickly, I realized that oftentimes the most trash, cheapest versions of cards are ones that people have essentially vandalized, right? Pineapple from the Cube Discord hooked me up with this amazing Deranged Hermit that says, I kill you, die, die, die on it in ballpoint pen, because somebody a million years ago was really frustrated at this card before it was worth any money and just wrote, I kill you, die, die, die on it.
Or they were really excited and enthusiastic about this card.
It's true. And so I've got a bunch of cards that are like, interestingly trashed, right? They're not just really worn or whatever. They have weird kind of marks and vandalism on them, which I think is part of the fun, right? Like, I think it's kind of cool to have these weird stories. I think I'm buying this Force Wheel from this guy today, and the Force of Will says in Sharpie on the front, 100% fully codified. Cody being the new-ish commander, the spellbook, 5-color commander that slings spells, but the lettering looks all weird. And I asked the guy for the story behind the card, and he was like, when I got it, it said 100% fully coidified with an extra I, and so to make it say codified...
the popular thing that people say about Force of Will.
Right, so that was confusing. I was like, what's coidified? He said, I have no idea. But so he expanded the D to make it like extra thick and kind of consume the I next to coidified. I posted this to our play group, and somebody had a good theory that it actually used to say 100% roidified, which kind of makes sense,
a little more sense
with the ripped
guy
in the art. And if you look at the C at the beginning of codified, it's kind of like all smushy and weirdly misshapen. So that's my theory for what it is. And just the idea of somebody new to this cube being like, what's going on with this card, and getting to like tell this weird story of like the history of this card and how it came to be in this cube is part of the fun for me for sure. So the next couple things that I think feel especially old school Magic to me, the themes I want to explore are, one is Mill as a win con. I don't like Mill in Magic typically, and I don't like it for similar reasons we might talk about next week when we start talking about Poison. I don't like the idea that you and your opponent are playing on totally different axes by which to end the game, right? Where your opponent is trying to get your life total to 0, and you're like, I don't care about your life total, it's irrelevant to me, I'm just going to try and mill you out. I think it's really hard to make an environment where that still feels interactive, instead of just feeling like two decks racing to different goals past each other, and whoever gets there first wins. So for that reason, I've avoided Mill in the past, but to me, Mill as a win condition feels very old school Magic. I mean, it still happens in modern Magic sometimes. I think part of what happened, honestly, is that, especially in Eternal formats, there are just so many ways to not lose to Mill no matter what, that if it were ever to crop up in a significant way, it was a little bit of a deck in Modern there for a while with that free card. It says if your opponent searches their library, they can flip these things. They printed that extra crab in Modern Horizons, and people tried it for a little while. But there's just so many ways now to...
People always try and build around the latest crab whenever one drops.
Right, but there's so many ways to like get around it now that I think it's kind of hard to make that work, because if that deck ever became a reasonable share of a meta, a couple sideboard slots could basically totally negate it. The brilliant thing about sideboarding Mill cards is a lot of them save you from your graveyard, and so it's like, you're always going to find it if you're going to die to Mill, because they're going to flip your whole deck over.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons that we see less mill. I think part of it is it's just not something that people enjoy often because of the sort of reason that you're describing, where it just feels like you're operating on a different axis that people don't enjoy playing against. So I think the design of mill cards has changed a lot. I also think sometimes the contemporary mill strategies really focus around one or two build around cards, something like Sphinx's Tutelage to just turbo mill your opponent out. Whereas I think the old school mill was very different, where it was more just about an attrition game with a couple ways to mill somebody out, which I think does actually interact with the rest of the gameplay in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, I'm not a huge scholar of like the old school days of Magic, but the mill deck I'm imagining is the one that won with Stroke of Genius, right? The idea was you've got 4 copies of Stroke of Genius in your deck, and you're playing a control deck, and if you need to draw more cards, you just cast Stroke of Genius targeting yourself, you draw some more cards, and eventually you just end up stroking your opponent out by, casting it for 20 or whatever, and winning the game that way, because it is targeted card draw. So that's kind of the mill deck that I want to capture with this environment, is that sort of mill thing. What that led me to was like, okay, how do I make this somewhat interactive in a way that feels in the spirit of old school Magic? And so what I've really leaned into is graveyard strategies, things that care about the graveyard at all. The idea being that, okay, if you're going to try and mill me to death, as you're doing that, it's going to naturally enhance my game plan, right? I have a ton of flashback in here. I have a decent amount of threshold. I have threshold-inspired mechanics like Delirium and other things going on. So milling your opponent in a lot of matchups is going to just make their deck better. In a way that I think is very real, and it's going to be part of, I hope, part of the sort of back and forth gameplay of the mill decks is like, when can I actually start milling my opponent? Do I have to like run them out of all their threats first and then start milling them? Like, how am I actually going to balance these things?
Yeah, I think that works really well for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons that I really love graveyard sort of themed environments, when it's just the graveyard is prominent, is it gives you a lot more space for more incremental kinds of advantage. I think a lot of cards we see today just say draw a card, and that's an extremely powerful effect. But when you have mill, looting and rummaging and sort of surveil, these kinds of mechanics just give you more ways to make cards that have meaningful but smaller sources of advantage.
Yeah, I mean, a great modern card I've included is Faithless Looting, which I think totally could have been an old school Magic card. It's got flashback, it's got an old school mechanic, it's simple, it's obviously very pushed, but it's the exact kind of card that's going to bolster these kinds of decks in a way that is something I really want to play with in this environment. The other kind of linear deck that I really think of when I think of old school Magic is Burn. I mean actual Burn, not like a red aggro deck that's got 16 creatures and, a couple burn spells that are used to remove creatures and then later on can go to your opponent's face. I mean a deck that is designed to burn your opponent out, and sure, it has some creatures, but it's got a huge density of burn spells, and especially burn spells that are really good at closing out a game. Fireball style effects. I have Price of Progress in this list, largely inspired by watching our playgroup member Jay dominate people with it at the Legacy event on Eternal Weekend. That's another interesting example where I don't know how often that's going to come together, where you can actually draft what appears to be a burn deck. I've added a lot of support for it in these kind of like ongoing incremental damage things. So I think the iconic one is Sulfuric Vortex. This to me is a great example of an old card that's a power outlier in a lot of pre-modern environments, but you have to build around. You can't just jam Sulfuric Vortex in your random red deck, because if you are not the aggressor and you don't have ways to tax your opponent's life total, you could just lose to your own card, and that's the worst place to be.
Talk about a card that takes a lot of investment and takes building around and playing around.
I mean, really, like, I didn't go through and make a list, but truly, so many of the old cards that you think of as like shaping old school Magic are exactly like this. It's like symmetrical effect that you have to like get some advantage off of, and doing so requires building your deck in a specific way. So put a bunch of burn spells in there. I think this one is naturally more interactive because all the burn spells also kind of double, obviously, as just regular old creature removal, and I hope sometimes there is a more linear burn deck that comes together, and maybe it'll be a problem. I don't know. That's going to have to be something we'll have to figure out during playtesting. I have a pet card in old school Magic that I really wanted to make work, and that pet card is Astral Slide. You know I love Astral Slide. You've been subjected to far too many games of my former 5-color cycling EDH deck that was just designed to make weird, convoluted board locks with Astral Slides and Life from Alums and stuff. So
yeah, I think like twice was too many.
So you know that a little too well. I love this card. It did show up in Extended briefly. There was a cool little Extended Astral Slide deck that was a thing. So it's not unheard of for it to be powerful enough to like be worth building around even in constructed formats. But I do think it's a bit below the power level of all the other things I'm looking at here. And so I was trying to think of ways I could like juice Astral Slide. I was like, how do I make this deck better without introducing a bunch of narrow cards or playing like a bunch of D- cycling cards just because they have cycling and hoping that by combining your bad cycling card with your maybe suspect build around, you can make a playable deck.
Switch it for Astral Drift, and then it works with your Faithless Looting. And
This is a good thing to touch on because Astral Drift is not getting anywhere near this cube. Even though it is a callback to an old card, it theoretically could have been printed in Old Border. I don't see why not. They had Wade You Cycle do this effect cards in Old Border, so it seems reasonable. I hate the flavor and I hate the art. I hate the art so much, and I can't do it. So this is very subjective, right? And in a lot of ways, honestly, this cube is me just like letting myself ignore potentially like the like stringent focus on gameplay and just be like, nope, I just don't like that. So even though it fits all my goals or whatever, it's ugly and I don't want it in my cube, which I don't often do in the Bun Magic cube. If it serves my goals, I'll often try it and see how it works. And sometimes there's a tiebreaker. I'll give it to the card that I like aesthetically more. But
when they print like a really cool Old Border version of Astral Drift, that's when you'll switch it.
if they print one with cool art, honestly, yeah. And by switch, I mean I put them both in, but I just can't deal with the current version. Either way, what I came up with, which was a big moment for me in terms of like another piece kind of falling together in the shape of this cube, was I just put 20 Ash Barons in it, or maybe it's 16. I put a lot of Ash Barons in the cube, just a ton of them, which is the only thing I'm breaking Singleton for right now is my big stack of Ash Barons. We did get an Old Border printing of Ash Barons with, I think, the Commander decks from last year, some Commander product or something. So that's kind of cool that it can still be Old Border versions of the card, even though it's a modern card in the pre-modern cube. I'm really excited about this and what it could potentially mean for the environment, because there are a fair number of decks that will want the Ash Barons more than other decks for just fixing, right? If you're the cycling deck, you're going to want Ash Barons more than you're going to want potentially other fixing lands, because it's thematic. It's on theme with what your deck is doing. And I dug deep and tried to find as many cool like cycling payoffs as I could to make other types of cycling things. Another card I'm really excited about playing here is Flameblade Adept. This is a red 1-drop from Amonkhet. It's a 1/2 with a Menace, and whenever you cycle or discard a card, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, which, yeah, here's a way you can now build potentially like a cycling burn deck. Like, is that potentially a thing? I'm hoping all these kind of pieces come together. Either way, I like that the Ash Barons are going to be higher picks for some decks, but are also going to serve as like a backdrop where it's like, if you didn't prioritize mana fixing, there will probably still be some Ash Barons going around in the middle to like later part of the pack, and you'll get a viable mana base, even if you don't get a good mana base, because power level wise, Ash Barons is definitely, you know, a step or two below a fetch land or, you know, a shock land or whatever, which I do have in this list, but it's still fine, right? And so being able to say, okay, well, I didn't prioritize fixing, I'll get this like, you know, 9th pick or 10th pick Ash Barons and like start to fill out my fixing, I think is something I'm interested in. But then other decks prioritizing it much more highly is very exciting to me. Plus, hopefully it will make Astral Slide a thing. Maybe.
I see you have some other basic land cycling cards in here as well.
Yeah. I mean, I included other playable cycling cards wherever I could, and because I just like cycling, and it's a very old school mechanic to me. So it's not just the Ash Barons that the slide deck is leaning on, but that is definitely a big part of it. Again, kind of just like following, this is like maybe an example of what we talked about in terms of like this emergent cube design thing. This is kind of the like pattern I went through when I was coming up with the shape of this cube. Where I went from the cycling deck and all these Ash Barons was I found other things that cared about discarding cards and stuff, like, you know, your Flameblade Adept or whatever.
Psychotog, I'm pretty excited to see that here.
Psychotog is a perfect card for this list in a million ways. And there's one other pet card, not of mine, but I've heard was a pet card of a lot of people's back in the day when they were playing casually, which is Megrim. This is 2 and a black for an enchantment that says whenever an opponent discards a card, they lose 2 life. Just a thing that I think a lot of people see, and it's kind of like a first level build around. It's like, oh, I can kill my opponent in this like weird novel way by making them discard cards instead of by attacking them, which is why I think a lot of people have like fond memories of playing it casually and trying to make cool Megrim decks. So I was like, how can I make this a competitively viable thing and lean into the idea of these build arounds that are power outliers? How can I make this work? And so I'm really excited, maybe most excited. Well, there's another deck I'll talk about in a second I'm also really excited about, but maybe the deck I'm most excited about is this Megrim combo deck. And the reason I'm really excited about it is because I think it can actually kill people kind of out of nowhere. So I do have Wheel of Fortune in this list. I have Memory Jar in this list. I have Windfall and a couple other ways to like just draw a bunch of cards and make your opponent cycle through a bunch of cards in their hand. And I love the idea of playing a deck that's like, maybe got some of these other attrition things that share some space with the burn deck. Maybe you're also playing like Ankh of Mishra and stuff and other ways to just like tax both of your life totals, and then you like end the game with the big Wheel of Fortune with your Megrim in play. The other thing I loved is I found a perfect card that I didn't even know existed that perfectly exemplifies what I want this cube to be, and that card is Fell Spectre. It's 3 and a black for a 1/3 from M19, and it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent discards a card, and whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. So clearly a callback to Megrim, and also a callback to, in my mind, one of the most iconic black cards of all time from Elborder Magic, which is Hypnotic Spectre. This idea that specters in Magic have this mechanic where they deal damage to you and you discard cards. Hypnotic Spectre is also in the list. So the fact that there's like this perfect little glue card that is a callback, that is the appropriate power level. It was an uncommon, right? So it's not pushed in terms of modern card design. It's a 1/3 for 4 mana. It's not crazy powerful, but
It was a card that I enjoyed playing in M19 Limited, though.
yeah, I'm not saying it's bad, but it doesn't stand out in this list for being a modern card and feel like, oh, well,
Right.
this is just, way better than everything else, and just kind of ties the whole room together. So I'm really excited about that. Megrim also does have a functional duplicate at 2 mana, which I haven't decided if I'm going to use yet. It's not in the list right now just because it feels a little weird to have 2 versions of it where one's just like strictly better than the other, but I think they realized that effect didn't have to cost 3 mana, so some playtesting will potentially realize where that's going to end up. Again, that deck is like perfect for me because it's using these pieces, right? These like iconic old school build arounds like Megrim. It's using the tutors that are there for a variety of reasons and, kind of sharing a bunch of cards with the cycling deck because you want more ways to draw and discard cards, sharing a bunch of cards with the burn deck because you want to like also just be pressuring life totals as you're playing the game so that your Megrim effects can actually close things out. The other deck I think I'm most excited about is the Naya Curdape deck. So Curdape is a card that Parker loves. Parker, who's been a guest on the show a million times, and if you're listening to this, you probably know Parker, unless this is your first episode, in which case, go find out who Parker is. Parker loves Curdapes in Parker's primary cube because he has a bunch of mana fixing, a bunch of typed dual lands, and really likes playing this kind of like slightly bigger aggro deck where it's multicolor, and instead of playing 1-drops that are 2/1s, you play 1-drops that are 2/3s and 2-drops that are 3/3s, Watch Wolves and stuff like that. Curdape, for those that don't know, is just a red mana for a 1/1 ape, and it says as long as you control a forest, it gets +1/+2. So if you're playing red-green or you have a type duel, it's just a 1 mana 2/3. This card I think has multiple callbacks. So the most obvious callback I think is a card called Loam Lion from Worldwake, and that one is the exact same thing but in white. So again, you need a forest, which is why it kind of becomes this Naya deck. The other piece that really brings it together is Wild Nakatl. This one is a green mana for a 1/1, and it gets +1/+1 as long as you control a mountain, and also +1/+1 as long as you control plains. This one could be a 1 mana 3/3. These kind of 3, I think, are the like standard bearers of this multicolor aggro deck I'm hoping will be a thing. But it does have a lot of overlap with other stuff already going on in the cube, because I think naturally, obviously, if you're a 3-color aggro deck, you're going to really want to prioritize mana fixing. And in this cube, I do have fetch lands, I have 20 copies of Ash Barrens or whatever. A lot of the mana fixing is going to fill your graveyard. The other kind of deck like this that was iconic in old school Magic was the like Threshold aggro deck, where you played Nimble Mongooses and stuff like that. So I think all of these cards together are going to make for a really interesting, like synergistic kind of Naya aggro deck that I'm really hoping comes together and can actually close out games. I'm curious to see how that plays out. I don't know where it's going to land on power level, but I really want that to work because I love the sort of shape of that deck.
I think that this specific aspect is what's really going to make this cube appeal to a lot of people, where you have these old iconic cards like Nimble Mongoose that was very powerful at its time, and just creating a place where people can play that kind of gameplay again and sort of get to play with these kind of nostalgic iconic cards is going to be a really big draw.
I gotta figure out if I'm gonna put Narwood Dryad into. That one's clearly a callback to Nimble Mongoose from Shadows of Innistrad or something like that. But it sparks less joy. We'll see if I end up playing it in. I probably will. One other very detailed deck here, which I have to just mention as a big inspiration for this cube. Really want to play Sapperling Burst and Fires of Yavimaya alongside each other. I got to draft them together in a deck of the old Border Foil cube, and I never got to draw them both in a game, so I didn't actually get to do the thing. We talked about Fires of Yavimaya last week. This is the enchantment that gives all your creatures haste, and you can sacrifice it to give a creature +2/+2. Sapperling Burst is enormously complicated. I'll let you go read the rules text, but these cards combine in a very powerful way, and it makes Sapperling Burst way better when your creatures have haste, basically. That's also a deck here, right? I just want to include those 2 cards and try and make a like bigger green-reddish deck that probably doesn't actually have any overlap with the like Naya aggro deck we just talked about, even though that's also a green-red deck. Also make that a thing where you're kind of going bigger, making a big mid-range deck where you play things like Sapperling Burst. So those are things I'm happy with. And there's all kinds of little callouts here, right? Like I have Fauna Shaman alongside Survival of the Fittest. Survival of the Fittest, another fantastic example of a broken card that you have to build your deck around, right? That card can do absolutely broken things, but you can't just jam it in you can just jam it in a random green deck, but it's not that good unless you have cards that are specifically playing alongside it. So I have all these cool callbacks in here I'm really excited about. I've got your Noose Constrictor alongside your Wild Mongrel for the Madness deck and all that kind of stuff. There's a couple things I'm not happy with. I don't know what to do with white and black, specifically white and black aggressive cards that are not leaning into that many-colored aggro deck. For example, right now I have what I think is okay support for a white weenie-style deck. It's all just 2-drops that are white mana cost. If you look at old school Magic, all the 1 and a white 2-drops are just wildly unplayable, and you have to play things like Longbow Archer and Silver Knight and White Knight and Whipcorder and all these cards that they're good, but they're all exactly white. And so they're in there for now, and I think they're going to be unplayable outside of essentially a mono white deck. Maybe if I'm lucky, we'll get some of these cool semi-splashes where you're playing 90% white cards, but you have other reasons to want fetch lands or ash barons for cycling or something, so you also put one basic in to, splash a powerful card. I'm hoping that happens so it's not just totally prescriptive, but that's kind of a problem. And to a lesser degree, but still similar, the black cards oftentimes mirrored the white cards in early Magic. So for every 2-drop that's white for some sort of knight, there's almost always a corresponding black 2-drop that's black for a similar kind of knight in black. So I also have a fair number of black 2-drops in here too. I don't know how these are going to play right now, and they don't feel right, but I also don't want to stray so far from old school Magic Pump Knights are so iconic to early Magic.
Classic, yeah. They even, when Dominaria came out, they printed those 2 knights again with this, cool panoramic art, because it was just such an iconic part of the early game that there was this really obvious contrast between these colors in a way that there isn't as much between a lot of the other colors.
And to the point of the cards from Dominaria, both these kinds of cards have a lot of callbacks over the years. There's lots of modern border cards that are similar too, so I have a lot to pull on here. This is just not resolved yet. I'm missing a piece. I'm missing a piece of these decks where these cards can be in the cube and not feel like they are just super narrow, you're either drafting mono white or maybe mono black, but I really don't think that's going to be supported with the current card pool, and so I don't really know what deck wants Knight of Stromgald and Nantuko Shade, but they're in there right now because they feel like they belong there, and I got to figure out how to make them at home, but those are things I'm not totally thrilled about right now. You said you think people are going to like this cube. What do you think of everything we've talked about? Give me your harsh truths.
I'm really excited about this cube. I think that this idea of playing with new cards, but playing with sort of an older Magic mindset is something that I definitely think about with my main cube as well, where I do want the build-arounds to be fun and exciting, but I want them to be real investments, not just cards that just kind of work, you just put them in any deck. So that whole philosophy just makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm, similar to you, don't really love tutors in my main cube for all those same reasons, but it is really interesting to see how they actually do play a different role here, and that the fact that they are in a way sort of reducing diversity in terms of what one deck will do, but they increase diversity of the potential decks by making these build-arounds work. I think all that sounds super cool. I think a lot of the individual gameplay, like Burn and Mill, like we were sort of saying, are not necessarily the most interactive
kind of dangerous.
Gameplay.
Could be not fun.
Same with some kind of oppressive cards like Opposition and Pox, things like that could end up to maybe create some games that are going to be rough and brutal, which I think is just another aspect of older Magic that contemporary designs often just have a little bit of the edges rounded off to make them not quite as all or nothing. But
which is kind of one and the same thing. I agree. I think your cube has some very similar influences that I'm describing here, right? This idea of not having standalone power outliers and having everything be based on synergy. But there are also things you starkly avoid. In a lot of ways, I do not think of your cube as an old border inspired set or an old school inspired set, because
inspired just in that sort of subset
in that one little way it's inspired by that, but otherwise I think you're embracing the best parts of modern card design in the fact that they have rounded the corners off in some ways and made things less polarizing, and also you're playing the cards that are templated in a way that is clear and consistent, which is a thing that old border cards historically have not done. Even though they tend to be mechanically simpler, they're oftentimes templated in weird ways. So it's interesting that I think there's 20% of the goals of this cube do overlap with the regular cube, and then the other goals feel so out of place, right? You would never get anywhere near a demonic tutor in the regular cube or Parallax Wave or whatever. That one, actually, I could maybe see you trying.
We could try that.
That one's not totally out of the question, but there's definitely some things about that don't feel right. Fire Blast would never end up anywhere near your cube, so it's interesting that it's got these kind of like weird internal tension to it.
I guess something that I'm really curious about is how is this going to be drafted by people that are less experienced, that don't necessarily have those relationships to these iconic cards? Because, I mean, that's another huge difference is my main cube is very much designed to be approachable and accessible.
That is still not a goal here, per se.
Having a lot of depth, but here there's going to be so many cards where somebody's going to look at upheaval and say like, oh yeah, sometimes I might want to do that. I can imagine a game where I want to return everything.
I see, new players don't look at it and say that. They say, why would I ever want to do that? That's my stuff as well.
Or they might do that. So I think that, there's going to be a lot of cards that are really difficult to evaluate if you don't have that context. So that is kind of an interesting contrast, especially when you're thinking of this as your beater cube that you're maybe more willing to bring out and play at casual game nights. That might also overlap with a group of players that are less experienced, especially, just less experienced with these older cards. So it could end up being challenging and could be, especially, the combination of that level of experience is necessary and the polarizing gameplay when your opponent plays Pox. It's like, okay.
It's Smallpox, to be clear. Pox is not actually that good, but Smallpox is the inspired version that is much better. But I there's definitely I think of one thing that is always in my mind now when I'm working on any...
Pestilence is even the card that I'm trying to think of, but that's not in here currently,
That one's also not in here right now. Yeah.
Great.
So that one does have a color-shifted version in Planar Chaos, so, if I wanted to run that and Pyrohemia or whatever, I could do it. Something I'm always thinking about in cubes when I'm designing them now is just, I'm imagining myself sitting across the table from a new player, and I'm about to cast card X, and am I going to wince when I have to describe what it does? I'm going to be like, hey, look, bad news. You can't actually respond to me activating Recurring Nightmare with Disenchant because it's part of the cost, so it's back in my hand, so I'm never going to give you a chance to disenchant it. Or, hey, bad news, I'm casting this Upheaval, but I'm floating 6 additional mana, and then I'm going to play 3 mana rocks, so the game's going to go on for another 30 minutes.
Trust me on this, and plus, it doesn't say non-land. Read it again.
Yeah, and this cube has a lot of those cards where it's I'm going to wince when I have to explain this to somebody that was not playing during this era of Magic, which is just one of the trade-offs, I think. Conversely, I think to people that did play during this time, I think you're right. I think certain group of people are going to be really pumped to play this cube because it's going to be reminiscent of a kind of Magic that you just don't get to play anymore. If you're playing with modern cards, it's so hard to make a cube that feels this way, or that I hope feels this way.
Yeah, that's a thing that I feel more and more, especially just as we've been playing Cube with a bigger group and a lot of people of more different kind of Magic experiences, where you have those moments that suck where it's I'm going to cast this card. Let me read all the text to you and explain it. And there was a conversation in the Discord talking about foretell cards and is it worth playing just your Doomscar in a cube? And for me, in this environment of playing with lots of new players, that is exactly the question that I go to is how do I feel when I play against somebody who's never seen a foretell card before? It's there's no reason this card would ever be worth putting in a cube at the risk of me having to explain to somebody, I'm putting this face down. I promise you I'm allowed to do that.
I pay 2 mana and put this face down past the turn. Excuse me? What are you doing, sir?
There are just so many Magic cards to choose from. I don't need to put myself in that situation.
I think we're going to be talking about foretell cards next week, too, is my thesis.
Interesting. I mean, really, just the further we get from Kaldheim, that the risk of someone not having seen it before just gets that much bigger. And
it's funny, because at the time, and I still stand by this, we defended the idea that, there's no reason you can't put one foretell card in your cube.
Yeah.
The secret information is actually not that important, and you should just play it if you like the card and it fits your goals. At the same time, on a totally different axis, it's it sucks. And I actually think some of the people that were saying, oh, I'm not going to do it because if there's not 2, then they know what it is, I think they actually were feeling the same thing that we're feeling, but they were labeling it differently. And the feeling is just it sucks to have one card that has a mechanic that doesn't make any sense outside of that context. Even if it plays perfectly fine, it just feels bad. It's not good.
I mean, I think there's sort of 2 levels to it. One is if you know and understand foretell and are actually, experienced, maybe you could even name most of the ones that are likely to be there. You sort of need this extra information about the cube to know what is that face down card. And that's a different experience from this player has never seen foretell before. And so it's just totally confusing.
I was just thinking about how foretell is similar to morph. And I had another little detail I wanted to point out about this cube because I'm so delighted by its
how many morphs do you have in here?
It's a decent amount of morphs. And one thing I'm really hoping happens is part of having tutors for things like Astral Slide is that I really want people to play off-color morphs in their Astral Slide deck. That's one of the great ways that Astral Slide interacts with cards, is being able to flip stuff. Yeah. I want you to put the red Achroma in your white-blue slide deck because you can play it as a 3-mana card and then flip it into a huge angel. I'm really hoping that happens. We'll see. Let's do a quick pack one, pick one from this cube. We just spent the entire episode talking about it. I'll read the pack, and I'm curious to hear what you're going to take out of here. I think there's a couple of decent options. It's a good representative pack of what this cube has to offer. So the pack is Sensor, Nimble Mongoose, Wheel of Fortune, Chain of Smog, Viashino Sand Sprinter, Mother of Runes, Chromatic Sphere, Millstone, Eternal Dragon, Blast from the Past, Peak, Life and Death, Brainstorm, Wild Nacatl, and Fire Imp.
There's a lot going on in this pack.
It's funny because there's so much I want to talk about this pack, just because I get so in the weeds, and I love that we have cards like Peak and Sensor here, and like Fire Imp, because these are cards that are exactly the kind of card that I think if you had teleported me in my brain, or a modern cube designer in their brain, back to 1998 or whatever, these are cards they would put in their cube. They would understand, yeah, actually, even though Peak is way worse than Brainstorm, it's actually just good to have a density of this kind of effect. Or, sure, Fire Imp's not as good as Flame Tongue Kavu, but it's still really good to have a 3-drop creature that comes into play and deals damage to stuff, even if it's not like super duper appealing or whatever. So I love that those cards are in here for that effect. I love that we're seeing, pieces of a lot of the decks we talked about. We're also just seeing some big power outliers. So what are you going to take out of this, or what are you at least looking at?
So the things that stand out to me are Blast from the Past. This is a little bit of a weird card to see here. It's an uncard that it's basically a burn spell, but also has madness and cycling and buyback and
has all of the old mechanics.
It's got all the old mechanics.
It's literally called Blast from the Past because it has all of
so I guess
the OG
that makes
mechanics.
Sense. I see what it's doing here. This card is confusing to read. It's confusing to play, but it's actually really powerful. There's like
the confusing thing about it is you'll never cast it.
Yeah,
that's
you
the
always
confusing thing about it.
Cycle it and then madness it. That's like the main mode you do with it.
I guess theoretically, if you don't have 2 red, you might have to cast it, but yeah, it's the same overall mana value to cycling and madness it, which means that you get the exact same effect, but you draw a card as well, and they can't counter it. Well, they can't counter the madness version, but they can't counter the drawing the card part.
Right. So that stands out. It just plays a lot better in my experience than it reads even. Mother of Runes is obviously a big power outlier. Brainstorm. Wheel of Fortune has a really high ceiling. I don't really know how to evaluate in this context. I feel like it is maybe more of like a combo-y piece with a lot of these other sort of
card,
synergistic.
So also good in the burn deck, right?
Right, yeah.
That's part
just
of it. Is
refill
like
your hand.
You've experimented with playing exactly Wheel of Fortune as like aggro top end, and you've had like okay experience. You said you've liked it sometimes.
It's fun. I don't win with it, but
my skepticism with it is that so often if you cast your Wheel of Fortune, even if it's turn 5 or 6 or something, you're not going to get to do a whole lot with the cards you just drew, and your opponent's going to untap with a full hand of stuff to do. I think exactly where it's good is when you don't care whatever they do. Like, go ahead, take your turn, cast big spells. Sure. I don't care. I'm going to untap and hit you for 9 points of burn because I just drew a bunch of burn spells. So I'm excited about that here too.
I'm leaning towards Mother of Runes.
I think that's definitely the safe pick. It's actually interesting we didn't get any mana fixing here. There is a high density of mana fixing in this cube, a pretty high density, so it's kind of shocking we didn't get any.
We have a Chromatic Sphere.
Sure, at least no lands. We have an Eternal Dragon. It's a pretty expensive fetch land. I think Mother of Runes is definitely the safe pick. I think Blast from the Past is a very close second safe pick. The card is really, really good. I didn't actually think of putting this card in here. Somebody on the Discord was like, you should put Blast from the Past in. And my immediate gut reaction was like, ugh, uncards. But I thought about it for like 2 minutes, and I was like, it's literally perfect. I have to put it in. It's so good. I'm in this like, dreaming big mood after talking about this cube. I'm taking Wheel of Fortune. I just want...
Okay.
It's like by far the best version of that effect, right? There's other kinds of things that are mimics of it. You can, I guess, tinkering into memory jars may be a better version of that effect, but that takes 2 cards. So it's a really, really good version of that effect, and I really love the decks that want to abuse Wheel of Fortune. So even though I think that Blast from the Past or Mother of Runes is a much safer pick, or Brainstorm, honestly, I think is also a pretty respectable safe pick here. I do have not Breaking Singleton on fetches, but I do include all 10 fetches, and then all the Ash Barons are also a way to cycle, so they also are a way to reset your Brainstorm. I think Brainstorm can still be really maximized in this list pretty reliably. So yeah, I'm going to take the Wheel of Fortune, though, because it's got that cool factor that is why I built this cube, right? It's like a card that, it could be awful, right? I could draft this card and have a deck that just doesn't want it at all, because it's not like a standalone power outlier. It's not just Minsk and Boo where I cast it and something happens. I have to then shape my draft around it, but that's why I built the cube. It's what I want to do.
Sounds like a pretty good reason to start there.
All right, well, this has been an episode that all the Anthony lovers are going to hate because I spent too much time flapping my lips in this episode, but we haven't actually done an episode like this where like the cube was very much in progress. And it's weird because I never know when to like talk about a cube on the show because we have new listeners to every episode, obviously, so I can't just like talk about a cube. I can't like casually mention my Neoclassical cube if no one's ever heard of it before and make any kind of reasonable point about it. So like that's a consideration. And also I don't want to like like with the Degenerate Microcube, which was early on in the days of the podcast, but like I felt for some reason like I had to not talk about it until I had like finished a big article and like announced it, which also feels weird. So like there's not a point where a cube is done. This cube is not done. I'm going to keep working on it. The Degenerate Microcube was not done when I published an article. I've changed it a lot since then, but I didn't want to like be waiting for some big, announcement. So what you got is this. This is like the factors that led to me designing and building this cube. I'm still trying to put it together in paper. I'm really hoping to pick up a lot of damaged cards at MagicCon Philly, which I know I mentioned on a previous episode, but I'm just drooling at the possibility of picking up some sweet, sweet damage cards. And yeah, I'm excited to see where this goes. I really want to have it at a point where it feels draftable after MagicCon Philly. Something else I didn't mention is this cube is, in the spirit of your cube, it's just a random size. I don't know how big it is. It's a 400-some cards.
428 right now.
Sure, it's slightly more than 360, and I think that's perfectly in spirit with the whole, like, I'm not being, like, extremely detail-oriented and, like, hyper-focused on the gameplay. It's more like, this is a cube for doing cool, old-school stuff, and that means there's going to be more variants. I put more cards in there, whatever. I'm happy to draft it as soon as I have, like, enough cards that it feels right. Right now, I'm missing mostly all the lands, and so that feels weird to draft it with just most of the lands missing. There's also a couple cards in there that are like parts of a combo deck that just the other combo pieces aren't there, so they're kind of do-nothings right now. But once I have enough cards that it feels like it's not a total trap to draft it, I'm going to start playing it even if I'm missing 20 or 30 cards. I don't care. We're just going to start playing this cube and see how it feels.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
That's actually maybe risky. Maybe I'll risk the first impression with the playgroup being a bad one because I didn't bother getting all the cards in paper first.
Well,
We'll see.
Then you have a clean out. If nobody likes it, you just be like, well, we'll get those last 20 cards and it'll
Yeah, it wasn't
all
even done,
tie the room
actually. So
together.
the fact that you didn't like it just says more about you than it does about me. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in if you made it all the way to this end of my navel-gazing about my own cube design. But I hope it was interesting and maybe would allow you to think about your own cubes in a different way or shine a light on ways you could potentially come up with your own cool idea for your own cube. Anthony and I are going to be at MagicCon Philly. We're going to be doing a panel on Saturday at 1:30 p.m. I don't think that's going to change. I think it's pretty locked in. I don't know for sure if there's going to be a video of it. I know that we had to give them permission to make a video, but they also didn't say for sure they were going to. I suspect it will be videoed and released by the Wizard channels shortly thereafter. So if that happens, we'll obviously post a link on all the social media places. I'm going to take a minute to plug our newsletter. I don't plug it very often. 9 out of 10 times, I use it just to announce the surveys for the set perspectives. So if you want to make sure you don't ever miss those, that's the best way to subscribe to that thing. I also wrote this week and just mentioned our YouTube channel and wrote a little note about it. And I got a bunch of nice replies from people that were happy to have gotten that message. So if you want a very infrequent newsletter, what I said in my most recent one is that it cost me like $10 to send it because of the way that email newsletters work. And so I got to have enough to say to you that it's worth $10 out of my pocket, which means I'm never going to spam you because I don't. $10 is like a good Magic card. There's a lot of cool $10 Magic cards, so I'm not just going to waste $10 spamming you with some nonsense.
Speaking of the set perspectives, though, our Phyrexia All Will Be One perspective is online now, so go check that out. Tell us what cards you're interested in testing for all of your cubes. If you have multiple cubes and you're testing different cards, if you are willing to put in the time and submit those as separate surveys, that will let us do potentially more interesting analysis, because what's important is that certain sets of cards fit together in certain cubes. So we appreciate everybody participating in that.
Okay, one last thing about the Neoclassical cube.
Okay.
I'm also really excited that it's going to be really easy to maintain. Like, sure, I'm going to add some new cards from new sets. It's going to happen, but very infrequently and at a much lower rate than my other cubes. So I can feel like it's up to date without having to, baby it.
I'm looking at, so I have this stack of black cards, and you've got, this Phyrexian Rager from, what set is this?
That's from
Nemesis? Invasion? No, Invasion's got a little walkie guy. I think this is Nemesis.
Invasion has, the weird shield. The walkie guy's Onslaught.
Oh, you're right. Damn it.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Nemesis has an axe.
Oh, you're right. Anyway, this Phyrexian Rager is just so cool looking, and I really do enjoy a lot of the new Phyrexian art. It's got kind of just a much more refined and consistent style, but some of these old cards are
There's something charming about not being refined and consistent.
Yeah.
Not having a whole team of storyboard people sending out creative guides to all the illustrators. I get why they do it all, and the finished product obviously shines in some ways, but there's something charming about the old cards that were kind of just janky.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are not janky. Like this Mind Slicer, gorgeous.
Yeah.
Great Kev
Beautiful.
Walker illustration.
Beautiful.
We got this really cool Faceless Butcher. I'm just going to read a bunch of card names here so that you have to put them in the notes.
Cool, great. I'm bidding on a Survival of Fittest on eBay tonight. That I say I'm bidding on it. I'm almost certainly going to get it because I'm willing to pay more than I should be for it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had it all together, but I was led astray the day you walked away. You were the clock that was ticking in my home, changed my state of mind.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Love so hard to find.
we got him.
Because it's completely trashed, like just destroyed. And it is signed by Pete Venters, the artist, which I have mixed feelings about artist signatures. I actually kind of would rather things not be signed by artists, even if they're totally trash, because I think people feel like that's a collector's thing, even though it only matters to like a very small chunk of people. But aside from being signed by Pete Venters, it is absolutely destroyed, and I am really excited about it.
Nice. I'll even take the time to make sure that in the notes we use the right editions of all these cards.
That's the trade-off. If you want to just read a bunch of cards,
Exactly,
so I have
yeah.
to write them down and pause my editing every single time you say a card to go type it and then start it again, you have to get all the sets right.
That's fair. I think that's
All
a fair
right, good.
trade-off. We
Good deal.
won't have all the wear and tear and the signatures and all that, but at least you can look at this cool classic illustrations.
Well, that's the other thing I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to scan all the cards in
everything,
for sure.
Yeah.
On that bombshell, that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James and Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by Anthony and I thinking really hard about magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. I randomly forgot to record this outro when Anthony was here, so he's not here to respond to me thanking him for doing so. See you next week.